Good evening, everybody. I am Chris Lockwood, Director of NEHS and the ELA Honour Society, and it's a great pleasure, as always, to welcome ELA, NEHS, Sigma Kappa Delta, Sigma Tau Delta, student members and chapter advisors, and NCTE members to this very, very special webinar with Jessica Lander, author of Making Americans, Stories of Historic Struggles, New Ideas, and Inspiration in Immigrant Education. As I mentioned, this evening's webinar has been organised in association with NCTE, the National Council of Teachers of English. We are very, very, very happy to continue partnering with them on a range of projects. They include the NCTE NEHS ELA Innovation Award for Teachers, and of course our participation at this year's or every year's NCTE convention. This year's is in Denver, and we hope to see some of you there. Some very quick housekeeping notes for all of you. We are using some fancy new webinar technology this evening, which you may not have come across before. Thus, to increase your viewing pleasure, you can click on the full screen button on your screen. That will make the video of Jessica and I bigger. The chat function is available. Jessica and I cannot monitor that chat function because we have quite a lot of things going on right now. But you can use that to provide any feedback you might have on this evening's interview. Before the webinar begins, I'd like to take a moment to say some special thank yous to Naaman Kent, Katie Mudd, and Jessica McCall, who've worked behind the scenes to ensure this webinar is going to be a great success. So thank you all very much. Tonight's interviewer is me, so no need for any further introductions there. And our speaker is Jessica Lander. She's an award-winning teacher, writer, and author. For much of the last decade, she taught history and civics to recent immigrant students in a Massachusetts public high school and has won numerous awards for her teaching. Those include being named the 2023 Massachusetts History Teacher of the Year and one of the 2023 top 10 National History Teachers of the Year, a 2023 Massachusetts Teacher of the Year finalist, and a top 50 finalist for the Global Teacher Prize in 2021. Jessica writes frequently about education, policy, and teaching. She is the author, as I've mentioned, of Making Americans, Stories of Historic Struggles, New Ideas, and Inspiration in Immigrant Education, which was recently, very recently awarded the 2024 George Orwell Book Award for Honesty and Clarity in Public Language from the National Council of Teachers of English for writers who have made an outstanding contribution to the critical analysis of public discourse. So congratulations, Jessica. She's a co-author of Powerful Partnerships, a teacher's guide to engaging families for student success, and is also the author of Driving Backwards. She is currently a History CoLab Senior Policy Fellow and a Reimagining Migration Senior Education Policy Fellow. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you so much for having me, Chris. It's just really lovely to be here this evening.
We are very, very excited to speak with you as well. So we do have a series of questions that have been submitted by students, and you'll see that they come from around the world. I want to apologize in advance for any mispronunciations of names, because there are some names that I'm unfamiliar with. But if it's okay with you, Jessica, we'll get started.
Absolutely. Excited to talk.
Okay, so because this first question comes from Meena Chantapalli from Texas. And she says, in what ways might growing up an immigrant or being from an immigrant family impact the education of children and young people?
Fantastic question. Love starting off with that. I mean, there's so many ways. There are countless ways in which growing up as an immigrant will impact how you interact with schools in the U.S., how your family will interact with schools in the U.S., and how schools should be thinking about what they need to be doing intentionally to be supporting immigrant origin students. And I'm going to use the term immigrant origin a lot. For me, that the terms are hard in this field of capturing exactly who we're talking about. But today in the United States, 1 in 4 students are immigrants or the children of immigrants. 1 in 4. And so I use the term immigrant origin to include those who are immigrants and the children of immigrants. So I'm going to just use that term a lot, probably, but it might not be familiar with everyone. So thinking about particularly like how do schools think about intentionally supporting immigrant origin students, they've got to be thinking about how they can really invest in all the identities of immigrant origin students. Schools haven't always done that, and schools don't always do that intentionally. But sort of central at the base of all of that is the role schools play, the fundamental role schools play in helping students feel a sense of belonging in school or not, and particularly for immigrant origin students. And so what are schools doing to either show that they can come in all their identities, that they belong here, or what are the ways they're signaling us they don't belong? And belonging is fundamental for all young people. That sense of belonging is the foundation for building a life and pursuing one's dreams. If you feel a sense of belonging, you are moved to invest your talents and your energies and your ideas and your creativity in your community. And this is true for all students. It's true for all people, really, the importance of belonging. But it's really important for immigrant origin students who are creating new homes and new lives here right now. And so when I think about immigrant education and the impact of that in schooling, I'm thinking about all the small and big things schools do every day that impact students' sense of belonging. And that's in the policies, the practices, and the programs. So countless ways. And I'm excited we'll probably dive into some of those.
I think there are some questions further down the line that definitely keep that. So that's a great answer. I agree with you. I think this sense of belonging is something that we as an organization are working for. NCTE is working for definitely too. Sadly, I think in some places this idea of belonging is being very quickly sidelined in favor of other ideas. But again, it's something that everybody can do in their own individual way. As an educator, I'm an educator, but you can ensure that everybody's included and participating, even if people around you may be saying you can't or you shouldn't. I think
Right.
that's something easy
Schools
to
should be intentionally doing this. They should intentionally be showing students that they want them to show up in all of their identities. And so thinking about what are those ways that we can be tapping into the strengths of students and all of the expertise they bring, having lived in multiple countries and cultures. So I think it's a real exciting opportunity for schools, but it does need intentional, thoughtful work.
Right, absolutely. So our next question follows on from this a little bit. It's from Timitapolua Taiwo in Alabama. I'm going to apologize for that pronunciation immediately right now. And they say, what inspired you to become an advocate for immigrant and immigrant origin students?
Absolutely. My students. Like, first and foremost, I'm a teacher. I've had the honor and joy of teaching recent immigrant and refugee students for about the last decade, and most recently in a public high school here in Massachusetts. And my students come from all over the world, and they are the reason I do this work. They are, when I started out in teaching, I didn't know specifically that I wanted to focus on working with immigrant origin students. The job that I got in Lowell, after teaching for a number of years, both abroad and then in the Boston area, I got a job in Lowell, and I was working with immigrant origin students, and that as well. And I fell in love with this work, is seeing just the extraordinary strengths that my students bring to the classroom. They are cultural and linguistic navigators for their family. They bring a tremendous wealth of knowledge and expertise gained from having lived, as just talking about, in many countries and cultures. They have just tremendous amounts of grit and determination, having had to navigate many different systems. And they just inspire me every day. They're my why on why I teach. They're my why on why actually I set out from the classroom to go write this book and to do this work and to support other teachers both in the state and across the country working with immigrant origin students. It was wanting to be a better teacher for my kids. My kiddos are extraordinary, and I want to both better support them myself, and I want schools to better support them and invest in all of their strengths. So it is my students, first and foremost.
Okay, so let's move on to our next question, which is from Jada Marie Brake in Florida and Devin Malone in the British Virgin Islands. And they say, who or what inspired you to write on this topic in particular?
Okay, well, so the who I was sort of talking about right before is my students and wanting to be a better teacher with them and wanting to think about how schools could be reimagining immigrant education to better invest in their strengths. But the what too, in terms of inspiring me to write on this topic. So for those who haven't read Making Americans, and I hope you'll get a chance to read it, the book is divided into three sets of stories: stories of the past, stories of the present, and stories of the personal. There are 8 historical stories of landmark Supreme Court cases, laws, and movements that have transformed immigrant education. And I'm a history teacher, so I'm just outing myself as I will, like, probably talk about some of the history in a little bit and nerd out on it. I won't do that here, but it's like it's really fascinating history, and it's really important for those of us who aren't history teachers. It's really important for all of us to know. And so there are those stories of the past. Then there are stories of the present. Innovative schools around the country today, from a single classroom in North Carolina to an entire school district. Single classroom in North Dakota to an entire school district in North Carolina, that are doing really innovative, thoughtful, creative work with immigrant origin students, supporting them in a whole range of different ways right now. And so, what lessons can we draw from the work happening by creative educators today? And then finally, there's stories of the personal, stories of young people. If we're serious about reimagining immigrant education, we have to talk to immigrant origin students and understand more about their journeys and their experience of our schools. And one of the things that inspired me to write was not seeing these three sets of stories woven together. And I thought it was really important that we have side by side these three sets of stories and are able to draw lessons from the past, the present, and the personal to be able to imagine what's possible. And so partly it was drawn from that the desire to explore and then to share and weave together these three sets of stories.
Right, and I think that's great, because I think one of the things that we as educators sometimes suffer from is that we're not very good at sharing what we do well. And we don't blow our own trumpets essentially, right? So we don't know what's going on in this school in North Dakota, because they're doing amazing things that people are busy, they don't have time to write and present and share this information, maybe beyond their own school district. And it's always useful information. And again, the same thing goes with the students that we work with. We all work with a very particular set of students, but those students who are in a different part of the country may have a completely different experience, and they can be learned from as well. So I think it's really useful that it all comes together in the book. And like you mentioned, the history of this, there are things that we don't necessarily know. In the book, you talk about desegregation cases. We all get taught at high school that desegregation starts with Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, but it absolutely doesn't, and it all starts years before in California. So I think having that, going beyond what we all learn in history class about civil rights in all its forms
Mhm.
is really useful to have, because we don't always get that. As educators, we are also, I think, the product of the people that we were taught by, that we grew up alongside, and our perspectives are very limited. And that's why these sorts of books, I think, are very, very important for us to have. Christina Cortese in New Hampshire says, what was your research process like for this book?
Ooh, really exhilarating, and fun at many times, and then exhausting and daunting at other times, and sometimes a mix of both. And the 3 types of stories I just described, each sort of had a different type of research process. So, take the stories of the past. There was a lot of historical sleuthing that had to be done, and some really fun shaggy dog stories that I could tell you about tracing different, sort of small key moments, that as a reader, you'll just read through, but to, like, make sure that I'd gotten that fact correct, the work to do to try to find that, really fun. But for the history, it was reading tons and tons about particular movements. So you mentioned, the desegregation case in the 1940s in California, and I'm happy to talk more about that later. But having to understand everything that led up to that case, and then the impact of that case, and the laws, the policies that are impacting it. Just this is a lot of this was new for me, and so there was a ton of research. Then there was trying to track people down. I think for me, as a historian, it was magical to actually speak to the folks at the heart of this history. So as much as possible, folks were alive who were part of these stories,
Mhm.
trying to find them and asking if they'd be willing to talk to me. And again, people were generous. And so being able to speak to the lawyers, the plaintiffs, the advocates, the parents, the teachers who were deeply involved in transforming history, what an honor that was for me. Those were the history stories and the research there. The
Mhm.
stories of the present, going around the country and sitting in classrooms. So I got to step out of my classroom back in 2019 and spend a year on sabbatical, traveling across the country, fully researching. And then actually, I spent 2 more years researching and fully back in the classroom, and that was exhausting. But so many generous educators across the country invited me into their classrooms to let me observe their classes, to follow them down hallways, to sit in cafeterias with them, to sit in meetings with them, like early breakfasts and late dinners, and just really, really generous with their time. And that's a huge amount of trust to let someone else into your classroom to write about it. But it was spending a lot of time in classrooms and in all the spaces in the school to try to understand and be able to paint a portrait of what was going on and try to just draw out the lessons of what was going on in these different schools. And then finally, for the stories of the personal, it was sitting down with former students of mine for about 20 hours each, not at all one go, because that would be just wild. But in total, about 20 hours each with each student, and sort of long form, winding conversations where I had a set of questions that I was curious about, but really going in with the mindset of I don't know what I don't know and need to know. And so following through things through that they'd say and coming back on things. And then afterwards, taking all of this material and going, okay, so how do I organize this? And what are the lessons I draw out? And then how do I weave those together? But each of the three sets of stories actually had a very different style of research to it.
Right, and I think one thing that unites all those three stories is that people are doing inspiring and great things. People are great in general, and there's a lot of good things going on, maybe that we don't know about, but good things are happening.
Mhm.
Veronica Chan also from New Hampshire, sort of leads on from this. Is what part of the book did you find most challenging to approach and most challenging to write?
Mm. So I think I'll mention 2. One is that throughout, talking about all these people you're mentioning, these inspiring folks who are sharing their work. I mean, these are educators who welcome me into their classroom. These are folks who they are their family transformed history. They're my former students. And here are all these people who are sharing their stories with me. And that's a really generous, it's a really courageous thing to do, but really, ultimately, very generous thing to do. And so, how do I honor those stories in the telling of them? That is a tremendous responsibility I have of making sure that they feel seen and heard in the way I'm writing about them, and that they feel that their voices, their story is represented well. And I took that as just like both a tremendous honor and a like deep responsibility to make sure that I was sharing their stories in a way that honored the work they were doing. Um, that was big. And that was something that was an important weight throughout. And that involved also like sharing with them drafts of the chapters. And really not once did anyone come back saying, "Oh, I want you to take out a section here or there." It was really, "Oh, like that fact is wrong," which speaks to, I think, that hopefully they feel that they were really seen. But it's just a huge responsibility to make sure that their voices are portrayed in the way they would want to be portrayed. And then throughout, also just really wanting the book to do sort of 2 things. I wanted it to be these sets of stories. Ultimately, this is a book of stories
Mhm.
that hopefully draw readers in, um, both readers who are deeply involved in the education space, teachers, or in other ways involved in the education space. And my hope is that these stories help inspire them to be thinking about the work happening in their schools. But then I also want to draw people in who aren't part of the education space, and convince them that they should be involved and excited and interested, invested in this work. And so having to strip any jargon out of the book, educational jargon, legal jargon, because we're going into laws and Supreme Court cases, but really make it a book that was inviting to folks coming from a whole range of different backgrounds, not assuming any knowledge, and being something that would hopefully be gripping. And that's really fun to write. It's hard to write. It's really hard to write, but something that kept coming back to of how do we strip it of jargon, and particularly for me as like For the legal jargon, that was easy because the legal jargon was new for me, and so if I struggled to understand it, okay, I know that others are. For the teaching jargon, there's definitely jargon that I just don't even think is jargon, in the education world because 'cause I'm so embedded in it, and so having readers help me flag, "Oh, right, okay, so how do I say that in a way that's just inviting for everyone?"
And what was this? Is the next question is from Jay Phillips in Alabama. Um, what were some of the difficulties and successes you faced when actually going through the writing process? Because the researching is one thing, writing is another. So how what was that process like for you in terms of sitting down and getting pen to paper, text on?
Yeah. Oh, well, right. So there's all the research, and there's some fun stories I could go into there. And there's also just the roller coaster of, say, writing each chapter. And it was this like, it was funny in some ways. It would be like, okay, so like take one of the history chapters. Okay, read like piles and piles of papers and books to try to understand a particular time period and research and reach out to and find folks who are at the heart of this history to talk to them. And then share all of that in on like sticky notes and put that all up on the board and try to figure out, okay, how we're going to connect this all. Um, and basically at each stage going, there's no way I'm going to be able to understand this. So like say with the research, no way I'm going to be able to understand this. And then reminding myself, okay, I've done this before. I did this with the last chapter. And then we'd get through that and it's the organization and the sticky notes. There's no way I'm gonna be able to organize this all and draw a through line, but wait, I have done this before. And then I get through that, and then the writing. There's no way I'm gonna be able to figure out how to write this in a way that's engaging in the story. Oh, no, but I've done this before. And then the edit. And so each stage of remembering, okay, I have done this before, but it will also feel daunting again. And I'd
Mhm.
finish one chapter and then go on to the next chapter and do it all over again. Um, and so there was that just like knowing I have done this before. It was successful, but I know also that it will feel really daunting. There's also, of course, writer's block. And not like big, I think when we think about writer's block or talk about it, it's like these big long stretches of time of writer's block. But like if I'm working and writing and then suddenly I'm like staring at my computer for 15, 20 minutes and like I don't know where to go. I got in the habit and got pretty good at just shutting my computer, taking our dog Mochi, who's a golden retriever, out on a walk and having my phone set to do not disturb, but having it with me. And I found that within about 5 minutes of walking, suddenly ideas, sentences, lines, phrasing of words would come to mind. So I pull out my phone, write it on a note, and then put my phone away and keep walking. And then by the time I came back from a walk in maybe 15, 45 minutes, I would suddenly be able to sit down and start writing again and take that work that I'd done and then move on from there. And so being really disciplined about going, if it's not working on the screen, I gotta move and walk, and that's where the ideas are gonna come. And then I think one of the other really interesting, difficult parts of the book was the structure. So I just described to you the structure of these past, present, and personal. And for folks who haven't read it yet, those stories are broken up into what I call 8 pillars of belonging. And so I'm exploring the sense of belonging through these 8 pillars of belonging, from chances to dream and committed advocates to assurances of security and recognizing and valuing students' voice. And there's 8 of these. And for each of these pillars, there's one story of the past, one story of the present, and one story of the personal. Now, that's not how the book was originally structured. It was structured in a wildly different way that now makes absolutely no sense, but at the time in my head, it did. And I had someone read the book proposal I was doing for it. They didn't even actually read the chapters. And they're like, the book proposal doesn't make sense. I don't understand this organization. And I got really demoralized. And it was like January, it was snowing outside, and I was like upset, demoralized, but I also knew he was right. And so I went and took a walk with my dog. And Mochi and I walked in the snow, and it was about a 15-minute walk. And I realized, these stories of schools and these stories of like history and these stories of students, these are really stories of, it's the past. And then there are these stories of the present. And these are stories of the personal. And that structure came from a 15-minute walk. And then it was from there, actually, these 8 pillars of belonging that then became really the guiding force of the book, and it's something that I work with teachers on now all the time. Those were derived from then laying out these stories and going, okay, what are the lessons from them? And so I think some folks think that the pillars were first and then everything was set into them. No, the pillars came at the end and really came from the lessons. And then it was setting the stories into which illustrated each pillar.
Mhm.
And the structure, it's been wonderful to hear from folks who are like, I really love the structure of the book. And I really think this is a fantastic structure. I'm like, that's great. And I hope folks who have a chance to read it agree. It's okay if you don't. But it's sort of fun to say, you know what, the structure came really late in the process. And it's something I really struggled with.
Do you think that's a case of having to have done all the research first, and then that sort of conceptual framework fell into place? I mean, are you a person who writes while they research, or do you have definitive, this is my research period, now I've got all my information, I will start writing? Because there are people who sort of write and research at the same time and add things in and revise as they go. And there are other people, I have to say I'm one of them, who likes to do all the research, have it on paper in front of me, and then I sit down and I'd like to do the writing. How do you work?
Some of both, I think. I
Okay.
think for the schools, I'd really done my research. I'd gone to the schools, I had gathered all the material, and then there were, as I was writing, clearly things I was emailing them and calling them, being like follow-ups of, "Oh, I now know that this is important, and I'm not sure I understand it, so I can get some follow-ups on that." For the students, similarly, I did all the interviewing. There were clearly things I went back for.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think a majority of it was doing the research and then writing the chapter, but I was also, because there are all these different stories in the book, I was maybe researching a whole bunch of stories and then writing a story while still then going on and researching another. So it wasn't like I researched the entire book, set that aside, and then wrote the entire book. Um, and so it was a little bit of back and forth, but you're right to the structure of, I did go in thinking there was a structure though. And I had a great structure that in my mind at the time sounded great. It now, looking back on it, was horrible. And so I think having learning the flexibility to be like, what am I actually drawing from the stories I'm learning and talking to people about, and that should dictate what the structure should be. And I love that that's how it ended up happening, because it really feels much more true to what I'm trying to do, is drawing on these lessons to then derive what we should be doing with that and imagining what's possible.
Right. I think that's something that we as writers, we all need to learn, that, you can write something and then think, hey, this isn't working as it should work, or this isn't very good, I can change it, rather than, and I think lots of us keep going down the track. It's like, no, 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 I'm going to keep going with this regardless, come some hell or high water, this is going to happen. I think that whole idea, taking things, looking at things, well, actually, this, I don't need this, or this can come out, or this needs to change in structure or format. I think it's really that self-editing process, I think, is really probably the most difficult part of writing, I think, but one
It's
that we have to develop.
huge. And we need editors. We need people that we trust to be editors. So my father is my editor, and we have a very long editing relationship. In high school, it wasn't so strong because, I'm a high school student. Um, but it developed over years, and now he is like absolutely my most important editor. And we have a fantastic editing relationship. And you also need other folks looking at it, and you need to be open to just stepping back from your work and slicing lines that you thought were beautiful and actually, no, they're not really helping. And then be open to sort of finding new things and taking on new angles. There's just sort of one story that popped into my head, more of the sort of the research and writing and back and forth, that's just sort of fun. More on the research side is like, I finished the chapter on Lau v. Nickel, which is a Supreme Court case in 1974 that requires schools to provide language supports for students who are still learning English. Before them, many schools had a sink or swim model. And as I was doing the research, a number of people who had been part of the case were mentioning things like, "Oh, there was a uh, one of the briefs to the Supreme Court had a famous Chinese footnote in Chinese. They all referred to as the famous Chinese footnote, and I couldn't find this anywhere." And so I gave up after a while. Like, I did look, but no one can remember where it was. And I did look, and I wrote that chapter. And I put it aside and I moved on to the next Supreme Court case chapter. And I'm researching that and I'm talking to one of the lawyers in that chapter and I'm sort of explaining what I just did as sort of lead up. And he goes, Lau v. Nickel, this famous Chinese footnote. And I was like, where is this footnote? Everyone's told me about it. I never found it. And he then directs me to Roger Rice here in Massachusetts, who at the time in the 70s worked at Harvard. And I find a phone number for him online or for his organization, call him up or call up his organization, go, hey, I'm looking for Roger Rice, explain who I am. He goes, oh, yeah, I'm Roger Rice. I was like, oh, okay. And explain what I'm looking for. It's like, oh, yeah, no, I made that happen. And then he tells me this phenomenal story about how this he was working for Marin Wright Edelman. They were writing the amicus brief in support of Lau v. Nickel. And they wanted to show the court that if you didn't understand the language, you weren't going to understand anything. If you can read the language, it wasn't going to make sense to you, because part of the argument on their side was, well, kids will just learn. But if you can't understand the characters, there's no way for you to make meaning of it. And so what they did is they took a quote from Mao Zedong, and they had it translated by the Harvard librarian back into Chinese. And then they brought it down to Chinatown here in Boston and had it typeset. And then they brought the typeset to the amicus brief office and they sat it inside their Supreme Court amicus brief. And I'm told that the justices puzzled over the meaning of what this, because it was untranslated in their amicus brief, what this must mean. And if they had been able to translate it, it would translate to when shooting an arrow, one must consider the target. When playing the lute, one must consider the listener. But who knows if they ever translated it? But all this sort of long, shaggy dog story is to say that I found that whole story after writing that chapter and setting it aside and then going, oh, okay, well, now I want to go fit that in. And so rethinking, how do I structure that part to tell part of that story? And so being flexible and seeking out new information. And it's fun historical sleuthing.
Right. And you mentioned earlier, Jessica, that many of the people who were involved in the stories in the book, in historical, present, personal, are still alive and continue to be alive. So Chelsea Hunsey from Maryland says, well, what impact, what reaction did those people have to their stories being told?
So what was the impact for
for them on having their story told? Did they get back to you? Did they respond to you and say, well, thank you for telling our story. This has changed. Particularly, for example, for your students who are mentioned in this book, their stories are in this book. What impact did their stories being told have on them?
Well, I wouldn't want to speak for my students. My hope is that they felt seen in the book. I know that they read their chapters multiple times before it went out. I was like, but are you okay with everything I've written? And yes. And I was like, but are you okay? Yes. But really, do you want to read it again? They're like, yes, we are good with it. So my hope is that they feel that their stories were told in a way that honors the strength of their courage. It's been fun continuing to work with some of the educators that I profiled and continuing to learn from them over now many years. And being able to lift up their stories and connect their stories, like Myra Hayes, who's an extraordinary educator who's worked in Guilford County for more than 2 decades. I'm talking with her later today. I'm working on something with her, or continuing to learn from Leah Jolke out in North Dakota, and she works with her students doing a lot of advocacy work. My hope is that they feel that their stories were shown in the way they'd want them to. That's what many of them told me, but I definitely wouldn't want to speak for them. But just extraordinary educators and young people, and just the honor to get to hear from them, and how much that has impacted also my teaching and the work I do as an educator in my own classroom and my own community has been really, really big.
Excellent. So following on from that, and Sarah Morgan in California has asked, what is the most transformational thing you have learned about immigrant education through your work as a teacher and as a researcher for this text?
So many. But I think one thing that sticks with me is, and you mentioned this actually right at the beginning of our conversation, is how there's just so many creative ideas out there right now happening in our schools, our classrooms, our communities that we don't know about. And that's both really cool and also really frustrating because I want to know about them. So I think about in chapter 4 of my book, I profile a school called Enlace. And it's a school within a school. It's a newcomer school for recent arrivals inside Lawrence High School. Now, for those who are not familiar with Massachusetts geography, I teach in Lowell, or for much of the last decade, taught in Lowell, and Lawrence is 15 minutes drive away from me. But yet I didn't know anything about Enlace until I started researching my book. And I think back on it as a younger teacher, if I had had the opportunity to go sit in the classrooms of Enlace then, how that would have impacted my teaching much earlier on. And so I think one of the things that I continue to be struck by and want to think about how do we do those connection points better is they're phenomenal ideas everywhere. There are really creative, innovative teachers in all sorts of communities, and they're just often not known outside their classroom, outside their school, outside their community. And how do we make sure they are better known so that we can learn from them, so that they can collaborate with each other, so that we can sort of work together on working on new challenges. None of the teachers I talked to or schools I profiled said, "Oh, we're doing everything perfectly." All of them wanted to learn from each other. And yet there are not enough of those opportunities. And so I think that's one thing I'm really struck by. And then thinking, coming out of having written this book, how do we build more connections?
Right. I think, particularly at high school level, middle school, high school, where teachers are divided by department, and they have all the English department is together on one corridor, and all the math people somewhere else. I think it's very hard sometimes to get that information, that knowledge from people who are excelling in inclusion, maybe 3 doors down from you, but if they're not in your department. And this is something that I used to teach or tell trainee teachers when I was training trainee teachers, was to say, don't, you meet with your department regularly. You know what your department is doing. You know what's good, you know what's bad. But you don't know what's going on in the science department, and you don't know what's going on in the sports department. What about the history department? So I think going to, you're right in saying that things that are going on in classrooms don't get known beyond the classroom door. And it's really important for us as educators to make sure that we are going to, maybe somebody you don't particularly like as a person, who's who's a teacher in your school. This person's annoying. They're the ones who always ask an extra question in the staff meeting and keep it going longer. But they may be doing amazing things in their classroom, and that's those are things you can sort of set aside. It's like, hey, I'm going there to observe excellence in teaching and learning, and put aside my personal opinions about X person. But I think we are bound. We like to be in sort of almost like an egg crate. We like to be with people that we like and that we get along with, but that doesn't always lead to better teaching and better education, because we have to push ourselves out there. Fawzia Ahmed in Maryland says, of all the stories of struggles that have been overcome historically that you know about, that you have taught, which one is the most inspiring for you?
So many. I know, really. I mean, at the heart of each of these stories is the intimate and courageous work and actions of individuals who have made a profound positive impact on schools. I will very, very briefly choose one, maybe two. But again, I already outed myself as a history nerd, but I'm going to rein it in. But the first I mentioned very briefly, and you mentioned as well, is the story of Mendez v. Westminster. And this story starts in 1943 when the Mendez family returned to Southern California, and they go to enroll their kids in their dad's alma mater. And they are told they cannot enroll. They have to go a mile away to the Mexican school. Because at the time in California and much of the Southwest, there were Mexican and white schools. But the Mendezes don't back down. And they have recently leased a prodigious asparagus farm that has brought them back to Westminster, California. And they take the money from this farm and they organize with other families and they hire a civil rights lawyer and they sue the school districts. And their case goes up to the Ninth Circuit. And by the time it reaches the Ninth Circuit, it is supported by amicus briefs from across the country, including an amicus brief written by the NAACP, written specifically by Thurgood Marshall, who was watching this case as a possible test trial. Now, the Ninth Circuit comes back in 1947 in favor of the Mendez family. And 2 months later, the governor of California desegregates schools across the state. 6 years later, the governor of California steps down and assumes a new position. What position does he take up? Well, it's Earl Warren. He becomes Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And one of the very, very first cases he hears is Brown v. Board of Education, which, of course, you hinted at before, argued by Thurgood Marshall, who has in his notes the notes from the Mendez case. Now, what I love too about this story and just both the impact it has nationally, the idea that many people don't know the story of Mendez v. Westminster, but also the weaving in of different stories in this. So bringing back to that asparagus farm. Why were they leasing the asparagus farm? Well, they were leasing the asparagus farm from the Munametsu family, who had been recently incarcerated during the Japanese incarceration camps of World War II. And the Mendezes kept the farm and drove rent money to Potsdam incarceration camp. And then when the Munametsus were released in 1945, the Mendezes and the Munametsus lived together for a time on the farm. And so you have these like just powerful, powerful stories of folks standing up for civil rights in a whole bunch of ways woven together. And I'll tell you one more is that civil rights lawyer they hired with the money from the asparagus farm, a man named David Marcus, who for him, this case was personal because while he was the son of Eastern European Jewish refugees, he was also married to a Mexican immigrant and they were raising their 3 daughters to be bilingual. And as his daughter, who's now in her 80s, told me, this was personal to him from his own experience of being told by schools he didn't belong, that he loved playing music as an adult, as a kid. And there was a concert that he played when he was a kid. He played the violin, but he was told to play behind a curtain because he was Jewish. And another student was told to stand in front of the curtain and mime the music. There's just so many powerful stories of the work of courageous individuals fighting for positive change for our schools, to make them more inclusive, to make them value our students. So there's the story of Mendez v. Westminster. And then just one more very briefly, because it's top of mind right now for me as I'm doing some work in immigrant education policy, is the story of Plyler v. Doe, which many of you likely are reading about in the news because it's in the news a lot. And this is the Supreme Court case from 1982 that enshrines the right for all students, no matter the documentation status, access to the public K-12 system. And this case starts with the courageous act of 4 families in Tyler, Texas, including in those 4 families, Lydia and Jose Lopez, who the night before the trial packed their white Dodge Monaco to the brim with lots of their family possessions. And then the next morning before sunrise, wake their kids up, pack them in the car, and then drive 2 blocks to the Federal District Courthouse in Tyler. Just 2 blocks. I was in Tyler about a month ago, and standing looking out from their front steps, you can see the courthouse. And the reason they had packed their white Dodge Monaco to the brim is they knew, as Lydia has told me, they knew that by walking into the courthouse and suing their school district, which had was trying to impose $1,000 per student who could not prove legal residence, they knew they were risking immediate arrest and deportation. But that's a risk they chose to take for their kids. And both of these are their families, their lawyers, their other advocates. They're stories of courageous individuals fighting for the rights of students. They're just extraordinarily inspiring.
And I think a key part of this is that they're not long ago.
No.
This is me. It constantly surprises me. Is that this is all within living memory.
Yes.
And big changes have happened. Big changes will continue to happen. But we have to be cognizant that this is not the civil rights movement hasn't really ended, should never end. And it's not something that we get taught this in history class, but it's living history. People who are alive still remember these injustices and how they were resolved. Based on that, Jacinda Hall in Kansas and Lindsay Tindall in Arkansas say, based on recent changes in political climate, where do you think education, and particularly immigrant origin education, is going, and what will it look like in the future?
It's going to look like what we make.
That's a big question.
Yeah, I know, big question. It's going to look like what we make of it and what we do. I mean, having studied the history of immigrant education, I am struck again and again by the repeat of the rhetoric, that the xenophobic rhetoric and policies that we are seeing alarmingly on the rise today, we've seen in the past. There have been waves of xenophobic rhetoric and policies in our history, and our not too distant history. We had the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which profoundly transformed our immigration system. We had the anti-German sentiment that came out of World War I that led in the 1920s to half the states in the country banning the teaching of non-English languages. We had, of course, the incarceration I was just talking about with the Mendez family and the Munemetsu family, the incarceration of Japanese Americans, many of them American-born citizens during World War II. We see this pendulum swing back and forth. Just in the last 50 years, we saw just a real wide swing on the pendulum around bilingual education. So there's a great story that I won't fully go into, but real bilingual education has its birthplace here in Massachusetts, starting partially with a nun who was working for the city of Boston, for the mayor of Boston, who's going around interviewing new arriving families and finding lots of students out of school, which ends up leading to the first transitional bilingual education law in the country, which then leads to similar laws across other states, which then leads to a backlash of laws, and then English-only ordinances, and then in the 90s, laws that specifically attack bilingual education and try to kill and succeed in killing much of bilingual education in California, Arizona. And then that same campaign comes to Massachusetts with the express desire that if they can kill it in Massachusetts, where it was born, they can kill it across the country. And they do for many years. For about 15 years, bilingual education in Massachusetts is pretty much shut down. But then in 2017, we have in Massachusetts what's called the Look Act, which is really investing in recognizing the strengths of bilingual cultural education. And so I think sort of the long, short answer of thinking about the political climate right now is, one, recognizing that what we see today in rising xenophobic rhetoric and policy is things we've seen before in different ways. And so what can we do to learn from that history? We need to know that history to best combat it, to best work to have a more inclusive society, more inclusive schools. If we don't know that history, that makes it harder to do. And then recognizing that we can each play a role in this work. So I think first is read up on this history. There's like a phenomenal book on the history of xenophobia and xenophobic policy in the US by Erica Lee, just an extraordinary scholar, called America for Americans. There's many others. I talk about many of these stories in my book as well. Read up on this history, know this history, because I think it will look like what we make it to be. And we are going to be best prepared to advocate for schools that support our immigrant origin students, that support all of our students, if we know the history, if we know the policies in the past, and we can then be part of shaping what we want them to be in the future.
Excellent. So we have some questions now from people who are looking to go into teaching. I suppose this is Karen Perez in Mexico and Mathis in Georgia. And I think this question applies to future teachers as much as it does to current teachers. So what actions or preparations can I make as a future or current teacher that will make immigrant students' experiences in my classroom better?
Well, first off, thanks for asking that question. I mean, the fact that you're thinking about that intentionally says a lot about the culture that I think I would see if I stepped into your classroom. And so there are so many things, big and small, that you can be doing to ensure that your immigrant origin students feel seen, feel safe, feel valued in your classrooms. What are the books on the shelves of your classroom bookshelves? Can your students see themselves in those pages? What's on the walls of your classrooms that again show your students that they are seen, that they are valued for all their different identities? How can you center stories of migration in your curriculum? So I'm currently working as a senior policy fellow at an amazing national organization called Reimagining Migration that's really trying to center these stories of migration in curriculum, which have not always been intentionally centered. So how do we center those stories of migration in the curriculum? How do we partner with families? Our immigrant origin families are essential partners in the work of educating students. I mean, the data is really clear on that. That student test scores go up, graduation rates go up, all the metrics we want academically are positively impacted when we partner with families. But historically, and today in particular, because of the rising xenophobia in terms of rhetoric and policy, our immigrant origin families are not often asked to collaborate in schools. They might not feel seen, they might not feel comfortable, they might not feel safe, or they might not feel wanted. So how do you reach out to your immigrant origin families to learn from them about their children, about their hopes and dreams for their children, about how you can partner with them? These are just a few ways. There are so many. I think collaborate, go seek out folks in your community and beyond. But I think the big takeaway is you're already asking the right questions because you're thinking intentionally about how can you make sure your students feel seen and supported. And then there are just so many big and small things you can do.
And at this point, it's a good moment to say that NEHS, the ELA Honor Society, Sigma Tau Delta, and NCTE all have grants and awards in place to support this process, to support diversity, equity, and belonging in classrooms. So it's something to look into. There are and even beyond those two organizations, there are many people who are able to support this, as we know it's not always easy for teachers to do this, and they have to spend a lot of their time and sometimes money doing this. So there are supports in place for you. So take advantage of them. Thomas Cassidy in South Carolina and Kain Zaithan in Tanzania ask, how do we negotiate between the need to teach immigrants to facilitate assimilation and education which respects cultural needs and differences?
Okay, well, so what it means to be of a country, I'm sort of recognizing that these are questions coming from South Carolina and Tanzania. My focus is, of course, on thinking about students in the United States, but what it means to be of a country has changed over many decades, many centuries. Here in the US, what it means to be American looks very different than what it meant 100 years ago, than what it meant 100 years before that. I think back to the Americanization movement of the early 1900s and how different schools looked and thought about immigrant education. So my great-grandfather Daniel arrived in the United States as a 7-year-old boy, a refugee from what is now Ukraine. And when he arrived in New York in 1906, his language, his history, his culture, his religion were not wanted or welcome in school. And that had a profound impact on what he chose to bring forward into his life, and what he passed down to his children, to ultimately to us, of what we know of his story, of all of his language, culture, his religion. Um, I'm so glad to say that schools don't look like that anymore. That there's been just tremendous progress in recognizing that our students' many identities are real strengths, and that our country is richer for all of those identities, for all of those different strengths and different perspectives that our students bring. But that takes the advocacy of lots of individuals. And so I think for me, it's our students are most successful when their identities, all of their identities are celebrated and invested in, that they feel they can show up in their full selves. And our communities, it's not just our students, but our communities are most successful when our students can show up in their full selves. That this is a win-win for everyone. And I'm so glad that our schools don't look like the schools that my great-grandfather had to go to, where he couldn't show up in his full self, that he was really forced to assimilate and to abandon a lot of himself. And just the recognition that schools now have of It is better for our students and it's better for our communities, our classrooms, if our students feel like they can come in their full selves. And that's also just recognizing that what it means to be American changes generation by generation, and we get to redefine it.
Yeah.
And that's a powerful, beautiful thing.
There's definitely been a move away from the whole melting pot model to the salad bowl model, right? Which is, where everything, you have to have lots of different ingredients that go into the salad to make it nice. So yeah, I think that's something that's changed even within our lifetimes, Jessica, right?
Yeah.
I think that's something that we've seen change. So our next question then comes from Melissa Martinez, who is in Massachusetts, and Yunoa Zhang in Costa Rica. And they are ESL teachers, so English as a second language teachers. So they say, I've seen the emotional weight students carry with identity, language, and belonging. How have small acts of storytelling impacted? How can small acts of storytelling impact student confidence? And how can we integrate this meaningfully into curricula that is already rammed and very, very tight?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think to that emotional weight that they're both talking about, I think about it as the invisible backpack that our kiddos carry. That some of those the things in that invisible backpack we might see, we might learn, but we might not ever know everything that our kiddos are carrying. We probably won't. I love that both of these teachers want to incorporate more storytelling. I think that's really powerful. I think thinking about the ways to tell stories, I think a lot about opening doors, but not requiring any of my students to walk through them. That our students may want to share parts of their stories, and that can be really powerful. It can also be really healing, but they might not be ready to, and they might not want to, and that's also totally okay. And so thinking about any storytelling that is incorporated into the curriculum as ways for students to interact with it in different ways so that they can be as vulnerable as they'd like to be or not. And that's their choice. There are so many ways. I mean, I do a lot of storytelling in my classroom. Even though I'm a history teacher, I'm not a literature teacher. But there are big and small ones. So a really small one, when we're studying Angel Island, sort of the mirror of Ellis Island, but a very different experience for immigrants who came through, is in San Francisco Bay. There are in the Angel Island Immigration Center and Detention Center poems carved by Chinese immigrants into the walls of this detention center. Really, really just stunningly evocative, powerful, really sad often poems, and sometimes really hopeful poems. And they're short. So very early in the semester, in the year, when we're studying Angel Island, I have my students use these poems as models to write poems about their own immigration stories. Some of these poems are haiku-like. They're like 3 lines long. Some of them are maybe 10 lines long. I remember the first time I ran this project, and I sort of just was like, okay, this is going to be a short, quick thing. And I brought home the stack of papers and was sitting, going to grade them. And I sat there and wept reading these poems. So there are projects like that. I'm happy to talk about some of the others. We run a cookbook project that called the Tasting History Project, where we dive into stories at a larger length, and it's just been there's so many cool aspects of that. The national level, we do the We Are America project, which I'm happy to talk about, which again centers student stories. I think to your point about a tight curriculum, are there ways, and there might not be, so I totally recognize that some curriculums are more flexible or not, but are there ways to slow down a little bit and do one project and more iterations on it? I find that I see tremendous growth in my students' work as thinkers, as writers, in the iterative work. And I was first asked to iterate a few times in college and then really in grad school. But looking back on it, realized that in my elementary and high school years, I wasn't often asked to iterate. Occasionally was, but not often. Usually we handed a paper, we get a grade on it, it goes in the backpack, and it gets scrunched in the backpack and forgotten about. So as much as possible, I have my students have longer projects that we iterate on, sometimes 10, 15 times. But there's just so much more learning that happens when we're able to slow down a project. And so maybe you're still teaching other things, but one project is sort of continuing on. But I also recognize that sometimes it's only going to be the small storytelling that we can fit into our curriculums.
Kelly Creel from Florida asks, what do you think can be done to educate young people to protect against anti-immigrant and anti-democracy propaganda?
I mean, educating on this history. I've said it before that like this history is not taught; it is not known. If we don't know this history, we can't work to create a more inclusive society. So it's thinking about, say, teaching the full story of immigration or immigrant education in the U.S. When we teach about Ellis Island, which is what's often traditionally taught, also teach Angel Island. So for those who are not familiar with sort of the dichotomy between Ellis and Angel, on Ellis Island, immigrants spent on average between 2 hours to 2 days being processed. On Angel Island in San Francisco, they spent on average between 2 weeks to 2 years. And looking at who is coming through each port, predominantly in Ellis Island, when is Operation Western Europeans, and then Eastern, but Western Europeans, and then through Angel Island, a lot of Chinese immigrants. And looking at the really stark difference in how immigrants were treated. And so telling, of course, the story of welcome, which is absolutely a really important part of in the US of US history, but also telling this side-by-side story of xenophobia. In other countries, I assume it's the same. I'm not as well versed in the sort of the historical narratives of immigration, but teaching both sides of it, really sharing the complicated work of this. And then generally centering stories of migration as a point of empathy and connection, that we all have stories of migration. There's this phenomenal project that was created by Professor Krola Suarez-Orozco, and then Reimagining Migration has this moving stories conversation guide with it, where it asks students or adults to learn about one of each other's stories of migration. And when we think about stories of migration, it could be migrating from one neighborhood to another, or from one city to another, or from one state to another, or from one country to another, but that there are similarities in experience between those stories of migration, that you don't have to be an immigrant from another country to build connection and empathy with the idea of migration. And using that as a way to connect and build empathy across young people or adults as well can be really, really powerful. I've seen it in the classroom. I've seen it when I run professional development for teachers. And so it comes back to education.
Right. I was reading an article this morning. I can tell you the title. I have it. It's called Teaching Trump, a frame analysis of educators' responses to the Trump effect in American schools. And basically, it sort of discusses this particular question. What is a teacher's reaction to anti-immigrant, anti-democracy propaganda? And the conclusion is, from this particular study, it's a recent study, saying it's from 2020 it came out, I think, yeah, 2020, is it should motivate teachers. And it should motivate teachers to teach critical thinking skills, teach fact checking, teach the ability to work out what's fake news and what is not fake news, critical analysis of the media. And that comes from, as you said, Jessica, teaching history, knowing what has happened, knowing what as a result will happen in the future. So I think protecting young people against anti-immigrant and anti-democracy propaganda is impossible. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. But I think, as you're saying, it's these critical skills that need to be taught so people can make informed decisions and understand, what's actually going on in the world. Because we get a very skewed view, I think, from a lot of the media that we come across. Rachel Livermore goes on, I suppose, from that question from Kelly, and she's from Georgia, and says, how do you feel it is best to respond to backlash from those with opposing views?
So, I mean, again, education, helping folks have access to these stories, learning these stories, having conversations around migration that build those connection points. I think as educators, it is essential for us to be speaking up and recognizing that there might still be backlash, but that remaining silent sends a powerful and profound message to immigrant origin students that they are not welcome, they're not wanted, and they do not belong. And so even if one doesn't supports immigrant origin students, but is like, maybe, maybe this is partisan to speak up, or maybe there will be backlash, that by being silent, you are sending a profound and dangerous message. There's nothing partisan about speaking out in support of your students and speaking out against bullies. Um, our immigrant origin students are feeling threatened. They are feeling bullied. And it's really essential to be speaking out at this moment, and that there might be backlash. But that this is the work we do as educators, is standing up for our students, and it really does have a profound impact whether we speak up or we don't. Our students, our families notice, and it shows them whether they are safe or not in our schools. So really, really important to be speaking up and thinking about ways that you can advocate, and thinking about ways that you can build coalitions. So, for example, earlier this year, we were hearing from a lot of educators that they didn't know how to best support their undocumented students or students from mixed status family households. And so we collaborated with a whole bunch of organizations here in Massachusetts to create a guide that we then shared online free. It's a Google Doc, with key resources and sort of descriptions of some of the history, some of the policy, very easy to understand, with to-dos of what can you do to get involved. How can you make sure that you are supporting students and being an advocate for them?
If there's one thing that people take away from this webinar tonight, I think that would be it. So we're heading towards the end of this. So a quick question here from Kelly Davidson and Nandini Roy, both in Massachusetts. They say, could you share a little bit about the We Are America project? And you have alluded to this earlier. Are there any opportunities for teachers to learn from, connect with, and support the We Are America project?
Fantastic question. Thank you for asking, and perfect timing. So the We Are America project, it comes full circle. So this is a great way, as we're sort of coming to the end of our conversation, about belonging and the importance of belonging. So for many years, I taught a course looking at hard history in the United States, seminar on American diversity, and we wrote a book every year. And back in 2018, my students were grappling with what it meant to belong. Did they feel a sense of belonging? Some of them felt they belonged. Some of them didn't feel like they belonged. Some of them felt they belonged, but didn't think others thought they belonged. And so, as we've talked about earlier in the conversation, who better than to define what it means to be American today than the next generation? That what it means to be American today looks, as we've talked about, very different than it did 100 years ago or 100 years before that. And so my students back in 2018 set out to write each one story of self that helped us collectively deepen and widen our understanding of what it meant to be American today. And then they published a book, and they shared that book out in the community, and they spoke on radio and at universities and newspaper, and started community conversations that were really exciting. And my second semester class did a sequel to that book, sharing their stories. And then at the end of the semester, grades were in, they were about to graduate. Most of them were seniors. A whole bunch of them troop into the class and go, Miss Lander, this work needs to continue. And so that afternoon, we mapped out on the whiteboard what it would look like to create a national project, taking this curriculum we'd sort of co-created and this idea around a book. We wrote up an application, and I've turned first to my students that day going, so I can't do this alone. Would you do this with me? And they said, of course, yes. And so we wrote up that application, and we sort of cleaned up the curriculum, and we sent it out into the ether, not knowing if anyone would be interested. And teachers responded enthusiastically. And we got applications from across the country wanting to work with us. And so we created that first year a fellows program of We Are America Fellows. And my former students were mentors to these teachers across the country, who in turn worked with their students to help them tell their stories of self. We have, as of yesterday, opened the application for cohort 7. And it's wild to me that we are now about to start cohort 7 and close out cohort 6. And each year we work with about 20, 25 teachers across the country. We stipend them. We lay out a book of their student stories, and we pay for 100 copies of their stories to be printed and shared in their community. And then those stories also sit both in written form and oral form. Each student records their story up on our website, which you can go to, where there are more than 1,000 stories of young people from across the country sharing stories of self. And they're just so, so powerful to hear. If we're talking about this whole conversation about empathy building, of being able to listen to and center the stories of young people is so important. And it's been such an honor and a joy to be able to work with my former students, now colleagues, on helping center stories of young people from across the country. So that's a little bit about the We Are America project. Please get involved if this excites you. There are two easy ways. One is apply. Our application literally just went up. And so apply to be part of cohort 7. You'll work with us for a year. You'll get in-depth training. You'll get a stipend and then support in laying out a book and then 100 copies of your student's book. If that's not something you can incorporate into your curriculum, also on our website, we have those 1,000 stories, and we have teaching tools of how to bring those stories into your classroom and have students listen to those stories as part of maybe a 1-day or 2-day conversation you have about a whole range of topics that you might be working on with your students. So for all teachers, I hope you'll just listen to the stories yourself and maybe bring them into your classroom. And if you're like really excited, I really hope you'll apply to the next cohort, because we are currently, we are already starting to get applications, and the applications, it's been up for only a day. And so really, really excited about the next cohort.
This is the perfect time. School is heading to an end. The semester is heading to an end. It's time to start thinking about next semester. Again, NEHS, Sigma Tau Delta can support these sorts of projects that go on in classrooms. So, if you need that extra support, I mean, Jessica is saying that the project has stipend support, but if you need any extra support, we're also happy to help with that and make that happen. So our last question, and I think quite a timely question, comes from Sanvi Kadam in Washington. She says, as a result of your studies and your book, do you have a message that you could share with all immigrant and immigrant origin children who maybe are fearing for their residency in the US right now?
Yeah. I mean, having talked with so many young people today, both students, former students, it's a really scary time. There is this real rise in xenophobic rhetoric and xenophobic policy. I completely understand that fear. I hope that young people, particularly immigrant origin students here in the country, know that there are still so many people working to stand up against xenophobic rhetoric and xenophobic policy. There are teachers, there are members of state legislatures, there are advocates, there are community members. There are lots and lots of people who are standing up, even if the headlines are focusing on the really scary and very real stories, but that there are still people working to stand up against this rhetoric and this policy. The past and the present are filled with so many stories of courageous individuals and coalitions who fight back, who don't give up. Where we're standing up a coalition here in Massachusetts on a particular bill to work to support immigrant origin students just in the last couple of weeks. And so we will continue to speak out and continue to do this work because it's essential. And so wanting immigrant origin students to know that they're not alone, that there are lots and lots of folks in this fight. And then wanting students to know that that you're important. Your voices are important, your identities are important, your ideas, your experiences are important. They're essential. That all of us are better for you being here in our classrooms, in our schools, and in our communities.
Thank you, Jessica, for all this knowledge and all these ideas that you have shared this afternoon. I hope they've been inspirational for everybody who is watching. So thank you so much for being here. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. This was just such a fun conversation. Thank you to everyone who gave in questions for us. It's really exciting to be part of this conversation and part of this community. So thank you. And thank you, Chris.
No worries. Thank you. Thank you, Jessica. And thank you all for attending tonight and for sending your questions, as Jessica said, to us for this interview. If you do want to watch this interview again, it will be made available on our YouTube channel. So it's at Sigma Tau Delta English. If you click the bell to subscribe, you can receive some updates, interesting video content from us. If you would like to purchase text by Jessica, this is a really, really impactful read, and I highly, highly recommend it. You can do that via the English Honor Society's bookshop page. Jessica's texts are all listed there. And all your purchases through bookshops support independent writers and independent bookstores, which is also great.
Great.
So finally, look out for more information about our upcoming webinars for the 2025-2026 school year. Marguerite Sheffer, Angie Cruz, Gabrielle Zebin, James I. James, Mira Ahmed, TJ Clune, Bobby Garmas, and Ruta Sapetis are all confirmed speakers. So there's hopefully something for everybody there, and they have very interesting perspectives on life to share. So we look forward to seeing you there. Have a wonderful summer and good night.
Good night. Thank you so much.